I recently made a video about trams and why I believe that they are the absolute best transportation method for cities, especially because of the way they act as a catalyst to great urbanism, and how they're so compatible with great urban places, even pedestrianized streets. Today, I live in Amsterdam with its efficient tram network, where trams often run in dedicated lanes separated from car traffic, and traffic lights automatically change to allow them to sail unimpeded through intersections. I love taking the tram in Amsterdam. But I spent most of my adult life living in Toronto, where the streetcars are not like that. Riding the streetcar in Toronto is so immensely frustrating for me, not just because they're slow and inefficient, but because I know how much better they could be. And while Toronto isn't the only city with poorly designed streetcars, they have somehow managed to do almost everything wrong, which means they're a great way to learn about what not to do when building and operating a transit service. So let me explain how Toronto screwed up its streetcars. About 100 years ago, pretty much every city and town in the US and Canada had a streetcar, but almost all of them were torn out to make way for car infrastructure. And there were only a handful of cities that retained any of their streetcar lines. Today, Toronto has the largest historic streetcar network in North America, but Toronto also tore out many streetcar lines, despite strong opposition from residents, because the Metro Roads Department said that the streetcars were obstructing their progress in making the city more accessible to cars. There were also several lines that were replaced with subways, and this was actually a stated goal of the Toronto subway system at the time. On the opening day of the young subway in 1954, the guy who was in charge of the TTC, that's the Toronto Transit Commission, was quoted as saying,
"The Queen Street subway should be started at once, eliminating 80% of the remaining streetcar operation in the downtown area and freeing many main streets for one-way traffic."
Fortunately, after immense public pressure and the election of several pro-streetcar politicians, Toronto stopped removing streetcar lines in the 1970s. They even put streetcars back on Harbourfront and Spadina in the 1990s. Though now that there are streetcars on Spadina again, the amazing 1980s song Spadina Bus doesn't make much sense anymore.
Ain't no streetcar, ain't no streetcar. It's Spadina bus, it's Spadina bus.
The Toronto streetcars move around 250,000 people every weekday, which is lower than it was pre-pandemic, but it's still a huge number of people. That means that the Toronto streetcars alone, not including the subways or buses, have a higher daily ridership than the entire subway systems of many American cities. But despite this, only very minor improvements have been made to the streetcar network in the past few decades, and they're operated more like they're a historic obligation that the city has inherited, rather than as a proper transit network. It's actually amazing that so many people use these streetcars each day, despite the fact that they've been so badly neglected and chronically underfunded for decades. There are so many mind-bogglingly stupid ways in which the Toronto streetcars have been crippled, and it infuriates me every time I use them. Oh, by the way, if you're one of those people who doesn't like the videos where I get angry and rant about stupid urban planning done wrong, then you should probably watch a different video. Like this one from a few years ago about an amazing new train station in the Netherlands. Just click on the link on the top right. Now, before we get started, let's very quickly talk about terminology. In Europe, this is called a tram. In North America, this is called a streetcar. They're basically the same thing. A long time ago, they used to be called trolleys, though today that term is usually reserved for historic vehicles. Trolleys connected to the overhead lines using that single stick coming out of the top called a trolley pole, and I'll talk about that later. Streetcars often run in mixed traffic with cars, but they certainly don't have to. You may also hear these called LRT, or light rail transit. In Europe, LRT is usually reserved for higher capacity routes that are completely separated from other traffic, but there's definitely a lot of overlap between streetcars, trams, and LRTs, and the terms are sometimes used interchangeably. While there have been many new streetcar lines built in US cities over the past few decades, all new light rail lines in Canada use the term LRT, even if they're really more like streetcars. And I firmly believe that the reason for that is that the Toronto streetcars are so bad that they've given the word streetcar a bad name across the entire country. So let's talk about why that is. The most obvious problem with the streetcars in Toronto is that they are almost always stuck in traffic. It is very normal to be on a streetcar and to be moving so slowly that it is literally faster to walk. Lots of streets with streetcars also have on-street parking, so dozens of people on the streetcar need to sit and wait anytime someone needs to park. And seeing a streetcar with dozens of people on it stuck behind a single driver is a very common occurrence. The streetcars can't stick to any consistent schedule, and they often get bunched, so it is also very common to experience a long gap in service and then have several streetcars come at once. And since all the people waiting only get on the first streetcar, it stops longer and the bunching problem becomes even worse. In an effort to rebalance the service, the streetcars will often short turn, that is, turn around early in order to fill a gap in service. Which means it's also common in Toronto that when a streetcar finally comes, it won't even take you to your destination and you'll need to get out and wait for the next one. But even when you do manage to catch a streetcar that is actually going all the way to your destination, you'll still get stuck at so many red lights. In general, Toronto streetcar stops are quite close together, usually 200 to 300 meters between stops, while European tram stops are typically 300 to 400 meters apart. This means that you're usually not far from a stop, but it also means that when you're on the streetcar, it's going to stop often. Pretty much at every block. It is not an exaggeration to say that when you are on a Toronto streetcar, you will wait at almost every single intersection, if not for the red light, then for the streetcar stop. Since Toronto streetcar stops are usually on the near side of an intersection, what often happens is that the streetcar stops to pick up passengers, moves a few meters, and then stops again for a red light. And even when the light goes green, drivers will rush to get ahead of the streetcar. I've seen some cases where the cars block the streetcar for so long that the light turns red again. Or maybe you and 100 other people on a streetcar will get stuck behind a single driver making a left turn. It's also insane that streetcars don't have dedicated lights when they need to turn, and since turning right on a red light is allowed in Ontario, the streetcars do it too, from the center lane. It's absolutely infuriating to be freezing your ass off out in the snow while watching a streetcar slowly crawl down the street, only to get stuck at a red light for several minutes. And what's absolutely comical is that I've heard Canadians claim that we can't run trams in Canada because of the winter. Somebody should probably tell the Scandinavians. But when you propose literally any urban improvement, Canadians will claim it's impossible because of the winter, even when it's been proven to work time and time again in other cities. Meanwhile, trams can actually run more reliably in the snow than any other form of surface transit. They can often even run on streets that haven't been plowed yet. If Toronto had a proper modernized system, the streetcars could actually be the best way to get around in the snow. But instead, downtown grinds to a halt the first day of a big snowstorm, and the streetcars get stuck behind cars slipping and sliding in the snow. So you might think that all Toronto really needs to do is to put the streetcars in their own lane away from all the cars. But there are already 3 streetcar lines in Toronto with dedicated lanes, and yet somehow they still manage to screw those up too. The streetcar stops are still very frequent even on these streets, so the streetcar has to stop often. That streetcar you see in the distance is at the next stop, less than 200 meters away.
Next stop, Harvard Street.
But even on a street like this, with a dedicated lane, the streetcars don't get transit signal priority, so you'll still be waiting at almost every red light. And somehow it's even worse than other streets, because at many intersections, drivers have a dedicated left turn lane. Consider this example on Spadina Avenue. Despite the fact that the streetcar has its own dedicated lane and its own independent traffic signal, it still has to stop at this red light, which is bad enough. But watch what happens next. The light goes green for the drivers turning left. Even though there's a streetcar with dozens of people on it, they all need to wait so that a couple of drivers can turn left first. They very, very easily could have programmed these lights to allow the waiting streetcar to go first and then allow the cars to turn left, but they didn't. And this really gets to the heart of why the streetcars are so crippled in Toronto, because cars come first and everything else needs to fit around that. So even though this neighborhood has one of the highest population densities in all of Canada, where the vast majority of residents get around by walking and public transit, their streetcar service is consistently crippled so that no driver ever needs to be inconvenienced, even for a second. Now, the light has finally gone green, but you might notice that the streetcar crawls along at a glacial speed through the intersection. And the reason for that is that the switches that Toronto uses have a high risk of derailment, so the streetcars need to go very slowly through the intersection. That's not normal, but I'll talk about that a little later in the video. So with the short distance between stops, slow speeds through intersections, lots of red lights, and priority for cars, these streetcars still run extremely slowly, even though they have their own dedicated lanes. A typical streetcar stop on one of these dedicated lanes looks like this: a small shelter with some maps, a bunch of ads, and if you're lucky, a small bench. This is what a typical tram stop looks like in Amsterdam. At first glance, it might look similar, but an important feature is an electronic display showing the real-time schedules for the trams. So with a quick glance, you can see which lines are coming and when, giving you a pretty accurate estimate of how long you need to wait. You don't get that in Toronto, so people have to just stand around and hope that their streetcar will eventually show up. You could look at the predicted arrival times on your phone, but the streetcars are so unreliable that any time estimate is almost meaningless. On most European tram systems, there are also larger electronic displays inside that show lots of information, like what stops are coming up next, what time you're expected to arrive, and what other transit lines you can transfer to, and other useful information. In Toronto, the best you'll get is this one electronic display that only shows you the next stop right before you get there. Better not miss it. This makes the whole system so much more difficult to use for new users and people who only use it occasionally. But streetcar stops like these are actually the good ones because they're on an island platform next to the streetcar tracks. The majority of Toronto streetcar stops are at the curb, so anybody waiting for the streetcar has to wait on the sidewalk. And when the streetcar comes, they need to wait for car traffic to stop, step down into the street, walk across the car lane, and step up again into the streetcar. When the streetcar stops and the doors open, there are lots of red flashing lights and drivers are supposed to stop. And when you exit, there's an announcement of,
Please look right for traffic when exiting.
Needless to say, people can and do get hit by cars when exiting the streetcar. And since drivers rarely follow the rules, it's pretty normal to have to walk around a bunch of cars when getting on or off the streetcar.
You cannot see the streetcar. You are supposed to be there, not here. Stop that, okay?
There are also still a lot of streetcar stops in Toronto that look like this. Do you see it? It's that red and white thing stapled to a wooden pole. For many years, Toronto had high-floor streetcars with stairs. But since 2019, the entire system has been switched to low-floor Bombardier Flexity streetcars. In my previous video, I mentioned that one of the major benefits of modern low-floor trams is level boarding, which makes it trivially easy for anyone to board the tram. But unlike many other tram and streetcar systems, the streetcar platforms in Toronto, if they exist at all, are not at the same level as the streetcar. Look at how high this woman needs to step up from the platform in order to get onto this low-floor streetcar. On a modern tram system, a person in a wheelchair can just roll right onto the tram without any issues. There is no form of motorized transportation that is more accessible than a well-designed tram. Now, let me show you how it works in Toronto. If someone in a wheelchair wants to get on or off a streetcar, they need to push a special button. This notifies the driver who needs to get out of the streetcar, go to the door, and extend a ramp so that the person in the wheelchair can roll up it. And because the platforms are too low, this is also necessary even on routes with dedicated lanes and island stops. And there's only one door on the whole streetcar that has this special ramp, so you have to be ready with your wheelchair at the right place to push that button before the streetcar arrives. Now, you can occasionally find curb tram stops in other cities, though they're extremely rare and are usually just old stops that haven't been upgraded yet. So you might think that Toronto is also planning to remove these curb stops and replace them with proper island stops in the future, but no. They're actually literally doing the exact opposite of that. There used to be several streetcar islands along this street, but they were removed in 2017, and now passengers need to board from the curb. Why were they removed? The official reason for this is, and I shit you not, accessibility and safety. Now, of course, that's insane because an island stop with level boarding is both safer and more accessible than a curb stop. But the islands were too small to fit many typical wheelchairs, so they removed them. You might then wonder, why didn't they just make the islands bigger so that they could fit all wheelchairs? Well, because if they made them bigger, there wouldn't be enough room for cars. Wow, this is so much more accessible and safer than a platform right next to the streetcar. Thanks so much, Toronto. They did cut the curb here so that wheelchair users can roll down into the street. Hope there's no car in the way when it's time to board. So even though there are plenty of parallel streets without streetcars that drivers could use instead, in Toronto, cars need to be able to go everywhere all the time. Suburban politicians will claim that the reason they need cars to go everywhere is not because of their own selfish desires, but because people in wheelchairs need cars. But they're strangely silent about the problems that wheelchair users face on a regular basis when using the streetcars. The correct solution would have been to create something like this stop that was recently built in Amsterdam. There wasn't enough room here for a proper island stop as well as the car lanes, so the solution was to remove the car lanes and replace them with bicycle lanes instead. This street used to be a through street for cars, and it was very similar in design to many of the terrible streetcar streets in Toronto. But today, cars are blocked from going through this street, so the only motor vehicle traffic is for local destinations. Most of the parking spaces were removed too, and the few that remain are for unloading for the local shops. As a result, there is significantly less car traffic on this street, making it safer and more comfortable for everyone, and the trams run much more efficiently too. Cities should prioritize the construction of level boarding everywhere. Not only will this make it better for wheelchair users, it will also make it safer and more convenient for everyone else too. But Toronto can't do that, because cars come first, and everything else needs to fit around that. So they made public transit objectively worse, less accessible, and less safe for everyone, because they didn't want to inconvenience drivers. The average Torontonian doesn't know how good trams can be because they've never experienced it, so I often hear flippant comments like the streetcars should be replaced with buses. That's short-sighted, not only because of all the benefits of trams I mentioned in my previous video, but also because of the cost. When Queen Street was under construction and the streetcars couldn't operate, the TTC was spending an extra $1 million a month to maintain the same service level with buses because of extra labor, maintenance, fuel, and logistical costs. Of course, Toronto also regularly closes streetcar lines and replaces them with buses for months at a time, even for minor construction, while Amsterdam keeps the trams running even during major roadworks, because they understand that they're a critically important part of the transit system. But an even more common belief in Toronto is that the streetcars are really just an inferior subway, and the end goal of any streetcar line is to be replaced by a subway. But again, this is ridiculous because these are two different types of transportation, and they serve two different purposes. In my previous video, I showed this street in Rotterdam that has a metro directly under this tram line serving many of the same stops. And I talked about why great cities should have both metro trains and trams, and why a good tram can actually be faster than a metro for trips within the city, but only if they're not stuck in traffic. But once you've experienced a good tram system, everything about the Toronto streetcars seems insane. For example, I've talked before about how well trams fit into high-quality walkable urban areas. trams run on rails, so they're easy to predict. So many cities in Europe have trams running through streets that are otherwise completely car-free and pedestrianized. Every year, Toronto hosts a huge film festival called TIFF, and during the festival, King Street is blocked off to cars and the street is pedestrianized. But they also block it off to streetcars for some inexplicable reason. So even though lots of European cities run trams through pedestrian areas on a regular basis, Toronto refuses to do so, even temporarily. There also seems to be no understanding of how streetcars can improve a street and act as a catalyst to good urbanism. Even though Toronto has a blatantly obvious example of this with Queen Street and King Street, two streets with streetcars, compared to Richmond and Adelaide, which are one-way streets designed for moving lots of cars. All four streets were once identical, but the two that were overwhelmed by cars started to degrade. So many of the businesses closed down and the buildings that replaced them were built to be much less pedestrian-friendly. These one-way streets have become slightly better over the past decade, mostly because they have been improved by adding bicycle lanes and widening sidewalks. I lived on Richmond Street when there were no sidewalks here, and it sucked. It's so much better now. So these one-way streets feel slightly less like car sewers today, and life is slowly returning. But there's still such a huge difference compared to the streetcar streets next to them. It's such a clear illustration of how cars ruin urban places while streetcars improve them. And because of the streetcars, King Street and Queen Street also move significantly more people than the one-way streets for cars too. But the way they talk in car-centric Toronto, you'd think that these streets were critically important to the functioning of downtown, while these ones are a drain on productivity in the economy because they slow down the flow of cars. A typical 5-kilometer trip on the Toronto streetcar will take me at least twice as long as a comparable trip in Amsterdam, but it's sometimes wildly longer. The Amsterdam trams run on a schedule and are pretty consistent, whereas a streetcar trip in Toronto could take me 35 minutes or over an hour, and I have no idea which one it will be when I start waiting. There are many tram routes in Amsterdam that have their own dedicated lanes, including some with those fantastic grassy tram tracks that we all love so much, so trams here don't get slowed down by cars. But there are still several streets where trams are mixed with car traffic. The reason why they can do that without delaying the trams too much is because these streets have very little car traffic, because they're usually not through streets for cars. And they've also removed most of the on-street parking too. This way, it's possible to allow car access for local destinations while not needlessly slowing down public transit. But to their credit, Toronto actually did this on one segment of street, kinda. Well, it's complicated. This is King Street. It used to be the same as any other streetcar street with lots of parked cars and streetcars stuck in traffic. Data collected by the city showed that at peak times, the average speed of the streetcars was literally a walking pace, and reliability was terrible. Which was absolutely insane because the King streetcar had a weekly ridership of 65,000 people per day, but the streetcars were constantly stuck in traffic behind only 20,000 cars. Cars were taking up 64% of the space while moving only 16% of the people, while also making it slower and more dangerous for the other 84%. Which shows you just how inequitable the situation needs to get before Toronto will even consider doing anything to restrict cars. This project was a long time coming, and the city had been trying to do this for years. These drawings are actually from the first time they tried to do this, back in 2001. Finally, in 2017, the city agreed to a temporary pilot project on King to try to speed up the streetcars. At the community engagement meetings, city staff presented several options, including one that would build completely dedicated transit lanes across the whole street. The other option was to make the entire street only car accessible one block at a time, and only if car access was absolutely necessary. The plan was to design every block of King Street individually to get the best possible use of space for each local segment. Some blocks had unnecessary car lanes on one side that could be removed to make more room for wider sidewalks and restaurant patios. Some blocks where cars were no longer permitted could have dedicated cycling lanes. And some didn't require any car access on either side, so the whole block could be turned into a park, with the streetcar running through the middle. With the cars removed, there'd be lots of room for bike lanes, wide sidewalks, and parkettes. We were shown beautiful designs from other cities that were used as inspiration, especially the pedestrianized tram streets in Melbourne. The city printed out a huge map of King Street, and we wrote notes on what improvements we wanted to see for each block. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for the plan among downtown residents. So of course, Toronto did none of those things and gave us this garbage instead. I was really active in advocacy at the time, and this was the last big urbanist project in Toronto that I was involved in before saying this and planning our move to the Netherlands. So let me explain what happened. Suburban councillors were actively trying to stop the King Street pilot project from the start, and they tried every possible tactic to kill it. They fear-mongered about traffic chaos and would cry about an imagined war on cars on Twitter. Even after the pilot was underway, they found the few business owners who resisted the project and amplified their complaints with the help of the right-wing press. In particular, the owner of the Kit Kat restaurant, who commissioned an ice sculpture in the shape of a middle finger and pointed it towards the streetcars. This is exactly why the King Street plan was implemented as a temporary pilot project, because whenever the car-loving suburbanite councillors trotted out the same old tired excuses they always did, city staff could note it as something to measure during the pilot project and move on with the plans. The suburban politicians have a lot of control over Toronto City Council, and they're used to getting their way. And to be clear, it was purposefully designed that way by the Ontario PC government in the 1990s as a way to make Toronto more conservative, but I talked about that in a previous video. But in this case, the mayor wanted the pilot project to go ahead, so when it became clear that the suburbanites couldn't get it cancelled, they did everything they could to water down the project instead so that it would fail. And what finally worked for them was an exemption for taxis. They argued that taxis are public transit, so they should also be able to drive down all of King Street. And since Uber drivers use normal cars in Toronto, this would effectively mean an exemption for all cars. An all-day exemption turned out to be too much to get through the mayor and city council, but they did manage to negotiate an exemption for taxis at night, arguing that people needed taxis to get home from the nightclubs. They never bothered to explain why clubgoers couldn't pick up a taxi around the corner on another street or, take the streetcar or subway home from the club like the rest of us. But of course, that was irrelevant because it wasn't about taxis or clubgoers. What they really wanted was that the space on King Street couldn't be used for any other purpose because at night it had to become a through street for cars. The taxi exemption meant that the only things identifying that there was anything special about this street at all were these tiny signs at some intersections, which of course drivers routinely ignored. This became such a shit show that the city had to employ people to stand at the intersections to try to stop drivers from driving through. Of course, they couldn't employ people all the time at every intersection, but they also couldn't build more permanent barriers because of the taxi exemption. But there was a noticeable drop in traffic when Google Maps finally updated its directions at least. And the good news is that despite the best attempts of suburbanites to sabotage the project, the King Street pilot project was a success. Streetcar service became faster and significantly more reliable. Transit rider satisfaction increased substantially. Streetcar ridership increased to 84,000 passengers per day, which meant that this street was now moving more people than it was before, even though it often looks empty. Which is just more evidence that cars are a horrendously inefficient way of moving people through the city, so we shouldn't be encouraging people to do it. Even though bike lanes were totally cut from the project, the number of people cycling increased by over 400%, which is not really surprising because the only reason bike lanes are needed is because people cycling don't feel safe around cars. Which is why I argue that bike lanes aren't bike infrastructure, they're car infrastructure, because if you remove the cars, you don't need bike lanes. With parking removed, the space could be used for more productive things that would actually benefit local businesses and the people who live there. Makeshift streetcar platforms were built at some stops so that people could wait next to the tracks, though at other stops they just put asphalt blobs for wheelchairs to roll down from the sidewalk. But at least they put concrete barriers to block drivers from passing streetcars at stops, making them considerably safer. Foot traffic was also up because the street was more enjoyable without so many cars. And the people who live downtown and use this street every day absolutely loved it. It's also notable that the car-loving city councilors get really upset about the potential delay to emergency vehicles when it comes to any proposed improvements to the city, such as bike lanes. But those exact same people are totally silent about the fact that the King Street pilot significantly sped up emergency access by removing all the cars. As for the Kit Kat, people downtown boycotted the restaurant, showing them the middle finger, and it went out of business in 2020. But a new restaurant moved in, and this strip now has lots of outdoor seating instead of a couple of parking spots. Nice. The King Street pilot was so successful that Toronto City Council made it permanent in 2019. Though it still pisses me off that even though it's been permanent for 6 years, it still looks like crap. None of the original plans for parkettes, bike lanes, or wider sidewalks have ever been implemented. Meanwhile, over the same time period, there have been so many improvements to tram streets in Amsterdam that I actually have a hard time keeping track of them all, but I'll save that for a future video. But regardless, this entire King Street pilot project only cost $1.5 million to implement, and yet it was wildly successful at making public transit more reliable and getting more people to use it. There is no other public transit project that could have come anywhere near this level of effectiveness at anywhere near this cost. And that's the most frustrating part for me. This was a crystal clear, obvious success. So why was it not duplicated on every streetcar street in the city? The only reason is that they refuse to risk upsetting car drivers, even if it means making public transit objectively worse. Right now, Toronto is building a subway line that will bring people from the east side of the city into downtown. This project was originally called the Relief Line because it was being built to relieve overcrowding of the subway system. The goal was to provide an alternate path to downtown for people coming from the east. But here's the crazy thing. There are already several streetcar lines that go from the east subway and into downtown, but nobody in their right mind would transfer to them from the subway because they're way too slow. Toronto could have implemented a transit priority corridor here just like they did on King Street by blocking through traffic for cars, removing some parking spaces, and installing traffic signal priority at intersections. This would have allowed these streetcars to run significantly faster and more reliably and could have taken passengers off of the overcrowded subway line. Subways are great and Toronto needs more of them, but they also take a decade or more to build and cost tens of billions of dollars. These streetcar improvements could have been completed within a year, start to finish, at literally less than 1% of the cost of a subway. But they wouldn't do that because in Toronto, cars come first and everything else has to fit around that. Oh, and I guarantee you that the suburbanites will demand that we remove the streetcars as soon as this new subway line is built. The population of Toronto is growing at an insane rate, and now over 3 million people live there. And yet, there seem to be people who believe that you should still be able to easily drive downtown like it's the 1980s, when nobody lived there because it was bulldozed for cars. Ah, the good old days when there was lots of downtown parking. Nowhere to actually go once you parked, but details. Traffic in Toronto is terrible, and it's always the first thing that is brought up for any municipal project. I don't think you can understand just how pervasive this is if you've never lived there, but car traffic infects literally every discussion about any urban improvements of any kind. The argument goes that since car traffic is terrible in downtown Toronto, they need to make it easier to drive, but we know that can't work. Decades of research has shown that there is no solution to car traffic except viable alternatives to driving. But why would anybody take the streetcar instead of driving when they're going to get stuck in the same traffic anyway? Why would anybody voluntarily become a second-class citizen on a streetcar when they're treated like a first-class citizen in their car? So unsurprisingly, tens of thousands of people drive in downtown Toronto every single day, even people who live and work right along a streetcar line, because they've been given every single possible incentive to drive and dozens of disincentives to take public transit. This is not a viable alternative to driving, and yet, with a few small changes, it could be. First, the streetcars should have their own dedicated lane wherever possible. And if there isn't enough space for a dedicated lane, then that street should not be a through street for cars. There are lots of other streets that drivers can use instead where they won't screw up public transit. Second, streetcars should always have priority at traffic signals. Streetcars can carry well over 100 people, and they will always transport more people than cars, so they should always be prioritized. Public transit vehicles should almost never need to wait at red lights, unless another transit vehicle got there first. Third, streetcars should always have level boarding, and this should be a major priority for every tram network, new and existing. There is no reason to compromise on accessibility when it benefits so many people and is so straightforward to implement with modern rolling stock. Toronto could implement these changes very quickly and at a relatively low cost, especially compared to the expense of new transit projects, and they would be the start of a functional streetcar system that would be a true, viable alternative to driving. Because let's face it, the current car-first mentality isn't working for anyone, including car drivers. Toronto is building 2 new light rail lines, but despite using vehicles that are trams, the line is being built more like a surface-running metro and branded as an LRT to differentiate them as much as possible from the streetcars. The stations are much nicer than the streetcar stops, which is great. But in many ways, this project has swung the opposite way to the point where everything is totally over-engineered. And this excessive complexity is part of the reason why these projects are so expensive and several years behind schedule. At least Toronto is finally getting grassy tram tracks, though only in the parts running through car-dependent suburbia. But even though trams can drastically improve urban streets like this one, nobody in Toronto wanted to see another ground-running streetcar, and no politician was willing to stand up to drivers. So they decided instead to tunnel the LRT under the traditional neighborhoods that it would benefit from the most, which ballooned the costs even more. Canadians go on holiday to see the beautiful tram streets in Europe and rave about how wonderful they are. But Toronto can't build anything like this anymore because of the toxic reputation of streetcars. So these LRTs will not provide the benefits to the streetscape that trams do, but they also won't have the capacity of a metro train. They'll fit awkwardly in the middle and not do anything well. It gets worse though, because even these overbuilt LRTs with their own right-of-way will not have real signal priority at intersections. Cars will continue to have priority left turn signals, and transit vehicles will only get priority if they're running behind schedule to avoid bunching. They will not have the active signal priority that other cities use to speed up the trains. The TTC is using this same compromise system for buses and has the nerve to call it Advanced Transit Signal Priority, which is an absolute joke. So transit experts estimate that most of the time these new, wildly expensive modern LRTs will still be slower than driving. Which means the new LRTs will do very little to help with traffic congestion because few people will want to take the train instead of driving, all because Toronto refuses to do absolutely anything that might even mildly inconvenience drivers, even things that have improved traffic congestion in other cities. I can't express to you how fucking stupid and counterproductive this is. Why would you spend $15 billion on 2 LRT lines and not do everything possible to make them faster than driving? If you live in Toronto, I strongly recommend that you join the TTC Riders advocacy group and sign their petition to have proper transit signal priority on the new LRT lines. I've also heard that the TTC will continue their outdated policies for intersections, including a 25 km/h speed restriction. Which brings me to the other major problem with the Toronto streetcars, and that's the antiquated technology and even more antiquated operations. Switches, points, or turnouts, depending on whether you're American, British, or technically correct respectively, are the things that let rail vehicles change tracks. Tram and streetcar systems pretty much everywhere in the world use what are called dual point switches, where there are 2 rails that switch. These have been used on most tram networks for about 70 years because they are safer, more reliable, and more comfortable for riders. So of course, Toronto doesn't use them for its streetcars. They use single point switches where only one rail changes direction. These switches have a lot of downsides, but most importantly, they have a much higher risk of derailment. Which is why whenever a Toronto streetcar needs to go over a switch, the operator is required to stop and visually confirm the position of the switch before moving, and they are limited to a painfully slow speed limit, as low as 10 km/h through the intersection. It's absolutely ridiculous that Toronto transit riders need to put up with this. The TTC has justified the use of these antiquated switches because they are easier to manually switch, which should only have to be done extremely rarely in emergency situations. But Toronto still has many switches that have not been electrified, so somebody has to manually move the rail with a big stick. The reason why Toronto has so many problems with their switches and why they've been so slow to electrify them is because their electric switching systems were failing faster than they could be replaced. The original manufacturer was sold and resold to other companies several times, and the technical drawings for the electrical switches were lost in a fire. So the TTC has been trying to cobble together their own solution because they can't buy the equipment anywhere else. Of course, no other company makes this equipment because no other city in their right mind would still be using these outdated switches in the 21st century. There are two problems here. The first is that the money for upgrades to the streetcar infrastructure has been consistently cut from city budgets for decades, while billions are spent on car infrastructure. But even when there is money, there's another problem. The TTC is an extremely small c conservative organization. If they've always been doing something a certain way, they will continue to do it that way until they are literally forced to change. So even though no other city uses switches like these, and they require Byzantine hacks to keep them working, and they uncomfortably rock the streetcar and passengers, and they slow down every streetcar trip, and they make it harder to expand the streetcar system, and they put more wear on the rolling stock, and they make the streetcars less usable as a form of transportation, the TTC continues to use them because it's good enough, and it's the way it's always been done. Incidentally, did you know that the top of the new streetcars have no roof? They don't really need one, and this makes it easier to access the equipment, but I just thought it was interesting. But notice how there's both a pantograph and a trolley pole on this modern streetcar. I mentioned earlier how it's typically only historic trolleys that use trolley poles to connect to the overhead lines, and that's because trolley poles have a lot of downsides. They disconnect often, they wear out fast, they can't deliver very much power, and they are very unreliable, which is why most tram systems switched to using pantographs in the early 1900s. So of course, Toronto used trolley poles exclusively until 2017. There are even several segments that still haven't been upgraded today, which is why you may still see 19th century trolley poles hanging off of 21st century streetcar. And you might say, okay, who cares? But the use of trolley poles meant that the air conditioning couldn't be used on the new streetcars because it required too much power. The trolley poles were also disconnecting through several intersections, requiring the operator to get out and reconnect them. Also, notice how filthy the back of this streetcar looks? That's because the carbon shoe on the trolley pole wears out faster when it's wet, which is why the streetcars always looked like they shat themselves whenever it rained or snowed. But worse, faster wear on the shoes meant the streetcars needed to be taken out of service earlier in the day to replace them, which meant that on rainy days, there were fewer streetcars in service, which were, of course, the days when more people would want to take the streetcar. Trolley poles are also a lot less reliable than pantographs when they get ice on them, which is likely why a lot of Canadians think that trams don't work well in the snow. The result of all this antiquated equipment was that Toronto Transit riders were getting a shitty, unreliable streetcar system for decades. Is there any wonder why most people in Canada think that streetcars are a worthless, outdated method of transportation? Because, yeah, they are, when you're still running them with 100-year-old technology for no good reason. When you understand the history, you start to realize that Toronto has the largest historic streetcar network in North America not because of some enlightened understanding about city design and public transit, but because Toronto moves so slowly on everything that they just didn't get around to removing them all. The Toronto streetcar system is mostly made up of straight streetcar lines aligned to the grid, and despite a few small changes and the removal of several lines, it's pretty much been this way for over 100 years. So if you need to go diagonally across downtown, too bad. You need to go all the way in one direction, then transfer to another streetcar to go all the way in the perpendicular direction. Toronto has not yet discovered the Pythagorean theorem. But if you look at a map of the tram network in a typical European city, you'll notice that the lines are rarely straight. And that's not just because these cities aren't built on a grid, but because the tram routes have been updated over the decades to better serve modern transportation patterns. It's actually a normal thing for tram lines to update slightly every few years based on the latest passenger transportation data, but you'd never know that was a thing living in Toronto. I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and assume that the places people traveled to in Toronto in 1915 are probably a little bit different than they are today. But meanwhile, the streetcar lines are pretty much the same. I mean, come on, this transit map is so old they were still spelling showing with an E. When the English language has changed more than your streetcar network, you might be overdue for a change. But again, Toronto treats the streetcar network like they're doing historic preservation rather than trying to build the most efficient surface transportation system possible. And there's no good reason for this. Toronto could operate their streetcars as well as any European city, but they don't. It's a choice. There is no other form of surface transportation that could move as many people through a city as efficiently as trams. Nothing else even comes close. Which is why many cities around the world are building new tram and streetcar projects. Meanwhile, Toronto is sitting on a transit goldmine that most cities could only dream of, but they won't do anything about it. Unfortunately, the total lack of investment and outdated operations leaves the streetcar system open to attacks from right-wing politicians. When the infamous crack-smoking mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford, was in charge, he tried desperately to tear up the streetcars. Thankfully, he wasn't successful, but nothing has been done to ensure that doesn't happen again. The King Street pilot was championed by Jennifer Keesmaat, the chief planner of Toronto at the time. And to my Dutch audience, yes, Canadians pronounce this surname as Keesmaat. She was constantly under fire from suburban politicians and the right-wing press because she actually had a vision for the city and was public about it instead of being a quiet and dutiful bureaucrat. When she decided to leave her job, she was told to stick to knitting. Classy. Sadly, she did not win her attempt to become mayor. Since then, there's been no political will to make any serious changes to the streetcars, and nobody brave enough to promote a vision for what they could become. Toronto now has the most left-wing mayor they could reasonably hope for, but she seems interested only in minor tweaks and maintaining the status quo. And the new chief planner hasn't said anything publicly about streetcars at all. I assume he's quite proficient at knitting. So this is it. This is the best it's going to get. Without any vision, without any political will to make things better, the streetcar system will continue to be chronically underfunded, and the TTC will continue to treat the streetcars like some sort of historical obligation instead of a serious transit system. And so, the Toronto streetcars will continue to be shitty, and that puts them at risk. Someday, Toronto will get another right-wing car-loving ideologue for a mayor, one who isn't an incompetent crack-smoking idiot.
Mayor Ford, please stop disrupting.
And that person might be sober long enough to get the streetcars torn out.
That was extremely inebriated.
And when that happens, it will be a huge loss for the city, but the majority of Torontonians will celebrate, because to them, they'll finally be getting rid of their inefficient, antiquated transit system. And they won't know what they've lost, because they never had the chance to experience how good the streetcars could have been if anyone had actually cared enough to fix them. Thanks for watching. It took me several days of research to make sure I got all of the details correct in this video. And it would have been even longer if I hadn't been living in Toronto and involved in transit advocacy when a lot of this stuff was happening. I also filmed almost all of the footage myself over several years whenever I was visiting friends and family in Toronto. I believe that it's important that my videos are well researched, but also that I use real video clips and share my personal experiences as well. Unfortunately, well-produced content on YouTube and all across social media is getting lost in a sea of AI-generated garbage that's poorly written, derivative, and full of factual errors. It's orders of magnitude faster to write a script like this and put it over some stock footage, which means there's always going to be a lot more AI slop than what I make. And it's becoming harder and harder for people like you to find real humans making real videos. Every time I release a video these days, I get at least a dozen comments from people accusing me of using an AI voice, which is both frustrating and insulting because this is my real voice and I spend a lot of time getting the voiceover right. I don't use an AI voice or even AI voice editing. So if you'd like to support the work of an actual human making actual content that he cares about, then the best way to do that is by signing up for Nebula using the link in the description. Nebula is a creator-owned streaming service that isn't built to make giant profits for venture capitalists or big tech, and we're funded by fans, not advertisers. Which is why Nebula can afford to support the creators and give them a platform to make the videos they want to make. Nebula also has an AI policy, and we're committed to creating real content by real people, with over 200 talented creators and growing. We're not totally against using machine learning models, but they need to be useful and accurate, and most importantly, they can't be unethically trained off of copyrighted works without the original creator's permission. If you share our vision for a better platform for content creators, or you just want to support my channel so that I can make more videos like this one, then I'd encourage you to try Nebula. If you sign up at the link go.nebula.tv/notjustbikes, you'll support this channel financially and get 40% off an annual subscription. Nebula also has gift cards, and you can even get one for yourself to buy a year of Nebula with Ideal instead of a credit card. Thanks to everyone who supports this channel on Nebula, on Patreon, or even on YouTube by watching this video all the way through to the end. I appreciate it.